Thank you. It's really interesting that always when there is talk about Yugoslavia, this X is so often present because it's just been breaking up since it until it disappeared at the very end. Montenegro was the last to leave Yugoslavia, so to say. And what my colleague and I, Bojan Božović, wrote in this paper, actually he was supposed to present here, but since he was not able to come, it will be me. We looked at how autonomy was actually developed in Montenegro and what it actually means, in the sense that we tried to see which aspects of autonomy were really happening in practice, which were defined in the legal framework, but what it actually meant in practice. I will not go into details because this is a comparative analysis, so we compared it with Croatia and Serbia, but since we heard quite a lot about Serbia, especially councils, which I mentioned, and also it is a bit similar with Croatia, I will just go into details related to Montenegro. So it is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious and multilingual country. It is also very, very interesting because no ethnic group is majoritarian. Serbs, I will show the percentages on the next slide, are not a minority legally because they're represented by almost 29% of the population, according to the latest census. However, political parties representing Serbs, or the ones that define themselves as representing Serbs, want all the rights that belong to minorities. So it has been a kind of a clash between what they actually want and what they can actually achieve. And we will have next census probably now in the next few months, and it will be really interesting to see whether these numbers have shifted, and I expect they will be shifted because the census, at least in Montenegro, but I believe it has been the case in the other countries, more or less reflects political situation or reflects the fact who is currently in the government and who is in the opposition. And minority rights are defined in our constitution, which defines that minorities' identities is protected. There is also another law which is crucial here, and is a law on minority rights and freedoms. It defines the use of national minority symbols. Minorities can also use their own language, and they can be educated on their own language. Also, what is really important to say is the educational curricula can be changed in accordance with the number of minorities living in a certain area. So if, for example, which currently is the case, there are schools with majority Albanian population students, the curricula can be adapted so they learn, I think it's 20% of the curricula can be changed so they can be more familiarized with what is specific on the Albanian culture and history. Also, we've had the change of the electoral law, so now we have authentic representation in the national parliament. The electoral threshold has been reduced, so it's 0.7% for Albanian and Bosniak minorities, and it's 0.35% for Croat minority because their numbers are significantly lower. What is really important here is founding of the national councils, which have been defined by the law on minority rights and freedoms. So I will not go into detail what a minority is. I think it's more or less a definition which is quite similar to the ones that exist in practice. But minority councils are really important here because, as will be seen probably on the next panel, as we were able to see, especially in Saša's presentation, in Montenegro they have been one of the ways to protect minorities, or maybe it's better to say they were intended to be an institution which really supports and protects minorities. They are not their representatives, but they aim to support their activities. They are funded from the state budget. There were questions about this this morning on the first panel, and they can be funded only from the state budget so far. They're able to form initiatives, and these mostly refer to cultural sphere of rights. They can also create educational programs, which refers to what I spoke before. For example, in places where Albanian minority is majority on the local level. For the sake of the public, some of you might not know that all of the languages in the Balkan region except Slovenian and Macedonian are more or less similar. So there is no need for Montenegrin authorities to provide a different education on Bosniak, Montenegrin or Serbian language. So it is the same. And this refers only to Albanian, which is really a different language that cannot be understood. There is only one council per minority. These are minorities which have their own councils, and the funds they receive depends on their number, on the number of population they have. And what we discovered, I mean, the paper has a more detailed analysis on this, is that the actual outcomes mostly refer to the cultural sphere of autonomy, and these were some of the activities that councils actually did. What was also really interesting for us, that despite the quite a few activities that some of the councils did, the public support for their activities was not so high. It differs from one to the other. I will not go into details of this as well, but it did not go more than 60%. For example, I think that it was lowest for Albanian ones, because they just the Albanian minority did not perceive these councils to be there to do what was actually expected of them. So they did not achieve what the minorities actually thought they should have. At least that is according to the research that was done, I think, 4 years ago or 3 years ago. I'm not really sure now. I already mentioned this. I think it is also important to say that voting outcomes do not reflect the actual number of representation of minorities. So on last elections, which happened last year, Croat minority is no longer represented in the national parliament, which is really interesting because it only reflected political battles which were happening at the time. So there were two political parties representing Croats or Croatian minority. So the votes were split, and these two parties only reflected current political climate, which was thus that now they're not in the parliament, and it's really difficult to say what will happen on the next elections. But it's really different on the local level. And for example, in Ulcinj, which is the city which is where the Albanian minority is majority, Albanian parties receive much more votes than it is the case on the national elections. We don't have Roma representatives or even political parties representing Roma, despite the fact that around 1% of the population declared themselves as Roma. There are huge issues about employment as well, because there should be a progressive employment policy for minorities. However, it has not happened. It is again different on the local and on the national level. On the local level, this representation is much higher than it was on the national level. And I see that I'm actually spending time much faster than I thought I would. We just here present a brief overview of the Serbian practice, and I think Sasha already mentioned quite a few aspects of it. and also something about Croatia, which is again a bit similar situation, but I will go on to conclusion. So how is NTI understood in Montenegro? What it actually means? So we concluded that it mostly refers to the language use and education. I already mentioned that Albanian minority has a kind of a different situation due to the language, and also it has been the case because Albanian political parties have been represented in the parliament at least by one MP. Now it is two, so their influence was stronger, and also they have been a part of the government for almost 20 years, I would say now, so their interests were very similar to what were the interests of the government, but now they're not in the government. Now there is a discussion whether they will join the current government, but it's not sure. So I mean, the process is ongoing, and probably we will not know until it really happens. What is really missing is the clear guidelines for full implementation of the policies that should increase visibility and representation of minority representatives in the institutions, which mainly refers to their employment, for example, but also it refers to the use of language. Courts have been one of the examples which shows that there is a need of more clear guidelines, because it has very often happened that there are cases of Albanians who file how do you say it in English, who file a claim to the court, but then because they do not speak English, it's not so easy for them to do it in a timely manner. There is a need for a translation and so on, and no guidelines have been developed here. Overall conclusion is that the autonomy in all three countries was understood in the similar way. It mostly refers to the sphere of culture, I mean, broadly speaking, but there are significant differences. For example, in Serbia there is Vojvodina with a different way of understanding minority rights, as Sasha already mentioned. I won't go into details, but we think that there is really a need for developing more clearer oversight of the implementation of policies for protection of minority rights and for their autonomy, because the Constitution provides minorities quite a few rights and quite an autonomy, but in practice it has really depended on the moment and on the political situation, not really, I would say, on what has been a way of the coherent policies which have been evolving over time. And now with the current government there are a lot of issues which have been raised in relation to the status of minorities and their autonomy. So we will see, I think, as I mentioned, that the census will probably be by the end of the year, and it will be really, really important to see whether there will be changes and whether we will still not have a majoritarian population. And I think we won't have, but it's probable that the number of Serbs will grow a bit and the number of Montenegrins will be a little lower. But for the minorities, for Bosniaks and for Albanians, probably there should not be some significant changes. Oh yes, I forgot. We looked at some perspectives for the councils, and the Montenegrin ones are the least criticized, at least in the public perspective. So we also need depolitization, because one of the major critiques, as has been the case in the other two countries, is that political parties or their representatives actually define what councils do. So councils are not independent in this sense. And what I say in the end here, there was a bit of capitalization, so to say, for minority parties because they were part of the government, but now they're not. So we will see what happens if they join the government, whether they will be more involved in processes that they have not been a part of since last year. Thank you.